Okay, so to give special dignity to the Kiddush, it must be recited when the meal is to be eaten. It is written in Yeshaya, and call the Sabbath a delight. In the place which you call the Sabbath, i.e. Kiddush, you should enjoy the delight. So it's basically location dependent, so to speak. Where you say Kiddush, you should actually eat. Okay, then the second part of this is, one may therefore not recite Kiddush in one building and dine in another. It is permitted, however, to move from one part of the room to another, preferably with prior intention. This rule is important for one who has recited Kiddush in a sukkah, but due to rainfall is then compelled to eat in the house, or vice versa if the rain ceases. If the sukkah is detached from the house, one is regarded as eating in a separate place, and Kiddush must be recited again. Okay. Remember we discussed that.
We discussed it yesterday. Interesting.
Yeah. Damon, did you have a chance to speak to someone about that?
Not yet, because I'm waiting for Rabbi Cohen to respond to Gavin's excellent question. And Gavin's excellent question, which was actually discussed, was that if I'm going to be encouraged to lend people money, I won't feel comfortable lending them money if they can damage a property in their care, which is incumbent upon them to pay to me in lieu of a lien. Meaning, in simple English, I lend somebody money, they are going to pay me back with fixed property, and I decide to damage that fixed property under my possession so that they get it back in an atrocious state. So whether you destroy it partially or totally, the actual property itself, not only possibly burning the lien, but even destroying the property itself, which is actually in certain ways more direct than burning a mere piece of paper, and it renders that property worthless. You apparently can do it, but you cannot do it if it's my property and you just come over and damage my property. So Gavin asked a good question, then why would you lend somebody money if they're entitled to damage the property they owe you? Or they're entitled to get away with it.
Yeah.
And we haven't heard a response by Rabbi Kabb, but Gavin and I and you discussed yesterday with Arthur that perhaps the reason is that the law is a cat and mouse game, meaning initially there was only one copy of a piece of paper of a lien document. When I was work, you came to my house, you knew where I kept it in the drawer and you burnt it. Then there's today a deeds office where all properties are recorded in a deeds office by a third party under lock and key. Meaning even if I lose a copy of mine, providing I bring my ID number and proof that it's me, I can get a copy of the deed. So when a third party has a copy of the deed, it's much less disputable. And then furthermore, there might be cases where the law turned around and said, in fact, you cannot damage the property that is incumbent to your fellow for a lien on money that you owe, because he's not going to lend you money. Why? We've got a proof of a presbull, which means after the Jubilee year or the 7-year period when you're meant to let go of debts, the Beis Din bars over that debt. So the person owes the Beis Din instead of the creditor money, because otherwise, if people borrowed money just before the 7-year period, nobody's going to lend the poor because that debt is cancelled. So there's always a way to encourage the rich to lend the poor. And this rule of Gavin would prevent the rich from lending the poor. When I say rich versus poor, I mean those that have to lend compared to those that
discourage them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if I have no recourse, you keying the car you owe me, why would I do it? Okay, so that's a summary. Let's go to the new topic now, which is going to be joined onto this current share. We dealt with it yesterday, but unfortunately I've lost that share, so we're doing a quick summary. So the Gemara cites, we're on page 33, we're on Daf 33b4. So the Gemara cites another segment of the Brisa that's involved in explaining if creditors of the damager preceded the damaged party and collected the ox in payment of their debts, whether incurred the debts before the ox damaged or damaged before he incurred the debts, they have done nothing. What does this mean? They must forfeit the ox to the damaged party because the damage is paid only from the ox's body. So on that particular note, the Gemara analyzes this ruling. It says it's understandable that if the ox damaged before the owner incurs the debts, the lien of the damaged party preceded that of the creditors, and the damaged parties therefore have the first right of collection. But what happens if you have a case where he incurred the debts before the ox damaged, and the lien of the creditor preceded that of the damaged parties? Why should the creditor have to forfeit his ox? So in simple English, all we're saying is that I, for example, got into debt and I needed to borrow money from Kevin. Okay? So I borrowed money from Kevin and I didn't have fixed property, and Kevin was prepared to lend me. And I said, listen, I've got a bit of movable property. I've got an ox or two, and I'll sign it over to you in terms of the money's owed. Then I was having a really, really bad week, and my ox gored Arthur's ox. Okay? Now I owe Arthur money because of the damage my ox caused him. So I'm indebted to Arthur now. Now I'm having a really, really tough fortnight. And one weekend, my ox now, I'm running into debt now because I'm working out how to pay you two. So I'm borrowing from Gavin to pay back Kevin and Arthur, okay? Because they're hounding me. So now I'm saying to Gavin, listen, I've got an ox or two, no fixed property. And at the end of the day, can I borrow money from you? Gavin says, sure. So it says, the Gemara in a very simple English, is you can understand if the damage that I did to Arthur's ox came before you two, why Arthur would have entitlement to collect. But if Kevin preceded Arthur, or alternatively, if Gavin collected it before Kevin even, and possession is 9/10 of the law, we learned that obviously in the Gemara, it was basically in Bava Basra 44b. We learned that part. And we also learned the particular issue as far as in Kedushin, in Kusubot 94a, about that a later creditor can keep what he collected, even though there's a creditor that came before him and his loan predated him, because if he obviously collected the animal first, he's got possession, and therefore it might take precedence over a previous creditor. So the bottom line of it is, I owe Kevin, I owe Gavin for debts, and I owe Arthur for damage. So what we're saying here is, why is Arthur entitled to keep the ox above you two? Just because it works out that it's on the ox's body. What do we mean? With a tam ox, payment is paid on a leniency of half payment damages, and the second leniency is from the damager or the attacking ox. You pay on the gufa of that animal, which means there's a lien on that actual animal itself. And you pay to the weight of that animal. So why should this creditor have to forfeit the ox if he came before the damager? That's the bottom line. So here, Gavin brought up a good question. He said, look, at the end of the day, it's a lien on the actual body of the ox. That's what he said 2 days ago. And that's a very, very strong lien. And where he said that at the end of the day, if it's a creditor doesn't have a lien necessarily on that particular ox if he's got a financial equivalent ox. It's not like a property lien where you've got it on a particular piece of property. And even property, Gavin's got a point, because if you've got two similar fields, who's to say that lien is on that field? It might be on that quality of field. Does that make sense, Gavin? So that's what you mentioned. Am I accurate?
Great.
So what we're saying is here is that Gavin has got a point, but we've got to assume that either the creditor has one ox left, or alternatively, he might have branded that ox and wrote a contract and said, this particular ox that's branded with this serial code, and in the contract, I'm giving to you. So that's what you call a very strong lien. So the Gemara presumes that the Bryce is dealing with a case in which the creditor also held a lien on the ox, where the debtor gave him a lien on his movable property along with a lien on his real property. So he gave it to him on both. But if he had no lien on that particular ox, Gavin, as the according to the Shita Mukubetzes, there'd be nothing to talk about. The Bryce, he said, would not be teaching anything because it'd be obvious that he must forfeit the ox since the damaged party does have a lien on it. So since the Bryce must be dealing with the case where both parties have liens on the ox, why should the creditor have to forfeit it if his lien came first? So let's make Gavin's question very strong and say that there was either a contract in the branding of that particular ox or it was his only ox. Let's perhaps say that, Gav, I'm not sure. But in other words, it's a strong lien. All right, we are entering the 34th daf. Congratulations, guys, we nearly finished the book. And the Gemara is going to say, and even in the case where the ox damaged before the owner incurred the debts, but the creditor preceded the damaged party in seizing the ox's payment. So there's two sorts of predecessing the damaged party. Either chronologically in date, I owe Kevin money before my ox damaged Arthur's ox. So Kevin preceded him in terms of when the event happened, and then Gavin preceded both Kevin and Arthur because he was the first to seize the ox and therefore has possession of the ox. So it's saying in either case, why should the creditor, either one, be required to forfeit the ox? So we're saying, hang on a second, maybe we should learn from this concerning a person who has two creditors, that if the latter creditor preceded the earlier one and collected his debt first, what he collected is not considered collected, and he has to forfeit it to an earlier creditor. And is there anything that you guys want to say on that point?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, Kev?
Kevin, you're right.
No.
And Arthur,
Okay. Arthur, I think, is the, I don't know if you could share your screen with us, but as long as he's listening, I'm happy. Arthur, you with us, bud?
there we go.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to share my screen with you guys a second, now that you're all in one party. So if you see Ketubot 94a, the Gemara with regards to what to do, the first Tana and Ben Nanas disagree, Shmuel said. So what are they what do they disagree about? Okay. The case where, okay, and they disagree with regard to a creditor whose promissory note was dated later than that of another creditor, and yet he collected his debt before the other creditor, leaving nothing for the other creditor to collect. So this is exactly the case where we're saying one one creditor was owed money first, but yet the second creditor collected the asset first. So who gets to keep it? So the first Tana holds that what the creditor has collected, he has not fully collected, meaning he will have to give up the property collected so that the creditor with the earlier promissory note can collect his debt. And Ben Nanas holds that what the creditor has collected, he has collected. So this is where the argument comes from. Okay, so we're almost done, guys. So we're saying, shall we learn from this concerning a person who has two creditors, that if the latter creditor preceded the earlier one and collected his debt first, what he collected is not considered collected, and he has to forfeit it to an earlier creditor? So there's a question whether or not this is the case. And the Gemara says, no. Actually, I can tell you that what the latter creditor collected is collected, and he need not forfeit it. And there, in a case of an ox that gored and was collected by a creditor, it's different. So what we're saying is that the law was never revoked about whoever seizes the asset first gets to keep it. Obviously, according to Rav Nanas, the Tana of the Brisa didn't agree. But we're saying that that has nothing to do with it. All we're saying here is that the damaged party has first right of collection, no matter which creditor is involved, and no matter what was seized. So, because the damaged party can say to the creditor, if the ox had been in your possession before it gored, would I not have collected it from you in payment of the damage? Okay? For that ox damaged me, from it I take payment. I'm just going to repeat this quickly. It's different because the damaged party can say to the creditor, if the ox had been in your possession before it gored, would I not have collected it due for payment for the damage it caused? So we had this discussion yesterday, and Gavin said quite rightly, it's a hypothetical discussion, and Tosfot agrees, and that's why Tosfot is unhappy. The reason why Tosfot is unhappy is the damager can't turn around to the creditor and say, listen, if the ox had been in your possession and it gored, would I not have collected it? Because the simple answer is no. The creditor didn't create this negligence. The owner of the ox owed two people money, and he wasn't watchful of his ox damaging. So all the creditor did was take what was his. And since the creditor took what was his, it's not his fault and that the ox damaged. It wasn't under his watch that it was damaged, and therefore why should he have to forfeit the ox? So Tosfot doesn't like the way the hypothetical argument has been put together. And as Gavin mentioned, that Tosfot's point was that the damaged party's claim, regardless of who came first or who collected first, his lien on the ox is the strongest one because he's the only one that's entitled to collect from the ox itself. He cannot collect from any other ox. Whereas a creditor, a normal creditor, can collect from any of the debtor's properties, fixed or movable. So that's what makes it so strong. All right, guys, we're going to end off there. Thank you for listening.
It may benefit those who are unable to say Kiddush at home, as we're familiar with, as you see in some of these shuls on Friday nights. Okay, so yes. Okay, so you can, for Kiddush, if you have wine, it's fine. Or grape juice, a reviet of that. Or mezonot, then you fulfilled Kiddush.
Okay.
If you haven't had it, if you haven't had any of those things, then you haven't. Then you need to say it again for yourself, and even say that probably at lunch when you do it as part of your Surah.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Good.
Sounds good.
Good. All right, guys, we're going to start the Gemara. We on 34. We on the 34th daf A1. So before we discussed the opinion on why the damager comes first. So having concluded that discussion of the previous brisa, the Gemara is going to cite another related brisa. So this is, it is complicated, but we're going to unpack it slowly. So now the first thing that we're talking about is the damaged and damager. So we're with regards to a new case. Okay, rabbis, Jeff, are you with me?
With you.
Okay. The rabbis taught in a brisa, if an ox that is worth 200 zuz gored another ox that is worth 200 zuz and inflicted an injury in it that decreases its value by 50 zuz, and the value of the injured ox then appreciated and stood at 400 zuz, but if the other ox had not damaged its value, it would have stood at 800 zuz. The damager pays half damage according to the assessment of the loss at the time of the damage. By contrast, if the condition of the injured ox deteriorates after the time of the damage, the damager must pay half damages according to the assessment of the loss at the time standing before the court for judgment. Does that make sense, Kev, or do you want me to read it again? We'll explain it again.
Is that what we read at the end of yesterday's shir?
No, this is what we did on Shabbos. This is the 34th daf that we're entering now. What we did yesterday, this is new. This is completely new. So I'm just going to repeat it again slowly because it's quite a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
So there's the first case of the brisa is if an ox that is worth 200 zuz gored another ox that is worth 200 zuz, and inflicted an injury in it that decreased its value by 50 zuz. And the value of the injured ox then appreciated and stood at 400 zuz. But if the other ox had not damaged it, its value would have stood at 800 zuz. The damager pays half damage according to the assessment of the loss at the time of damage. So before we show what the contrast is, let's just get this case, because there are two different contrasting cases about the damaged party. One is assessed at the time of the incident, one at the time of the trial. And both of those are actually to the benefit of the injured party, and we'll see why. So what's happening is that we both the attacking ox and the injured ox is worth 200 zuz, but the only injury that the attacking ox inflicted upon the injured ox is 50 zuz. And then what we're saying is, okay, so far this is very straightforward. And then the next part is that the ox itself appreciated in terms of time period. So we obviously know it's not in record time. So what's happening is there's a time of the incident, which is here in this timeline, and then there's a time of the court date. So let's assume that when the animal got injured, it was, I'd say let's assume it was probably a calf. The reason I'm saying that is that if we have a look at small animals and you have a look at a puppy, and you take a puppy at a few weeks compared to 6 months or 8 months or whatever the case may be, that's where you see the most amount of accelerated growth. Does that make sense? So we're saying, let's just say that the trial wasn't immediate, Gavin, and it might have taken 6 to 8 months. Who knows? It might have been like the trials today, where things took time. Do you know what I'm saying? Especially if it was in a major city and not in a tiny town. So let's just say that happened, and then the calf appreciated in value, Kevin, to 400 zuz. So the cow is now worth 200 zuz at the time of the goring. When it's held for appraisal at the court time, it is valued at 400 zuz, meaning it doubled in size. Now that's completely possible if it's a small calf and 4 or 5 months elapsed and it doubled in size. It's not unreasonable, Gav. We're not talking about probably an adult here. I was trying to think about what would be real and not just theory. But we would have said that it would have appreciated actually to 800 zuz, because animals and human beings have different growth points. Meaning, if you go to an endocrinologist, they've got a scale of how much development there is within a certain period of time. Within the toddler years, the infant years, etc. And animals have got a certain growth period. So this animal should have appreciated to 800 zuz in the timeline given. Let's call it 6 months between the goring and the incident of the court. But it only appreciated 400 zuz. So it did appreciate. So that shows that there is some form of recovery, or at the very least, it's increased in value. Okay? And therefore, at that point, before we go into the detail of this, we're saying that it's taken according to the assessment of the loss at the time of the damage. Now, why, Gavin? Why do you think it's taken not at the time of the court case, but at the time? In other words, even though the court case is happening, the appraisal is done at the time of the goring. Why? Whose benefit is that to, and why? Is it to the damaged party, Kevin and Gavin, or is it to the damager?
It's to the damage. No, that's to the damager when it appreciates.
Explain your logic.
If it appreciates, right? If it appreciates, no, to the damage. Sorry, to the damager, the person that damaged. If it appreciates, it doesn't affect him in any particular way.
Well,
he doesn't have to pay.
It does, because if it said that they judged the case according to what happened at the time of the trial, it would be in the damager's interest, because this animal has fattened up. And therefore, he might claim, the damager, that, look, the animal's on its road to a full recovery. Why should I have to pay anything? So if it's...
But didn't I say that the damager... Didn't I say the damager? I did say the damager.
Yes, but it's not to the benefit of the damager. It's to the benefit of the damage. Let me explain to you why. because it says the damager pays half damage according to the assessment of the loss at the time of damage.
Correct. Now, if that was done at the court case date, he would lose out the damager.
No, he wouldn't. Let me explain why. Because, and I've gone through this, Gavin, is because as the animal's going up in age, in other words, you're dealing with a calf to an adult animal. The animal is making super progress. There is a case late in the second brisa where the damager improves as a result of the appreciation, but not in this case. Why? Because it's not taken at the time of the appreciation. In other words, it's not saying that it's taking into account the recovery and the appreciation, because that would be done at the time of trial, not at the time of the incident of the goring, as the brisa says here. It's called loss at the time of damage. Therefore, it's at the damaged party's interest, where the damager can't turn around and say, look, your ox made a recovery between the trial, etc., and it's grown, so what's the difference? I consider that as though it's recovered. Does that make sense? So the closer it is to the time of the goring in this particular case, with regard to an appraisal for an increase of appreciation, the more it is to the damaged party's benefit. With depreciation, it's the opposite way around. It's to the damager's benefit.
What, if it's done at the beginning?
No, if it's done at the end.
Because then he pays liable
right,
for
let
less.
me just explain exactly. Let me just explain to you what I'm saying, Damon. Is that basically, if we took into account any sort of depreciation at the time of the trial and we show this progress, the damager might turn around and say, well, your animal's grown, what do I have to pay? The fact that it's backdated and the assessment is done at the time of damage is proof that this helps the damaged or injured party, because the damager can't get out of any payment.
Can't, but let's say it's valued at 400 at that time. So the damage. How would you know what the damage is if it's not done at that point in time? That's also a problem.
Okay, but that's a separate issue. Let's just say
that's a separate.
Hang on. Let's say they did an appraisal at the time, but they could only set a court date for 6 months hence. Then they reweigh the ox. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. That aside, this is for the benefit of the damaged. So I'll explain why. Kev, let me explain to you.
No, I get it. I'm all right.
Right, because the damaged party ultimately recouped his loss through the increase in the ox's value, right? So the damager must pay half the amount of the initial damage, which is 25 zuz. So we're talking about the attacking ox as a tam ox, and even though the damage was 50 zuz, he only owes 25 zuz. That's clear. But what we're saying is that because the damaged party recouped some of his, loss. How do we know that the ox that was worth 200 zuz is now worth 400 zuz? Okay? But he can't argue, the damager can't argue, Gavin, that the initial loss was recovered through the subsequent appreciation, right? Because the effects of the damage are still felt in as much as it prevented the ox from appreciating fully to the 800 zuz. That's what Rashi says. Meaning, let's just say, Kevin, that the ox appreciated from 200 zuz to 400 zuz, but it had reached its potential according to the milestone that it was expected to reach at that age. And it made a full recovery. In that case, the damager could have a claim and say, your ox has recovered full, and because your ox has recovered in full, I can see at the time of the trial, since 6 months has elapsed, I no longer have to pay. And the reason why we're backdating this to the time of the actual incident is because the ox did not fully recover. It did appreciate, but had it not been injured, it would have actually appreciated to 800 zuz and not the 400. So though 400 is progress compared to 200, it's not at the growth that it should be, Gavin.
Yep.
And on that basis, the damager needs to pay the 25 zuz. Now, there is a case that is going to be discussed as maybe the ox fattened as a result of the damaged party feeding his ox, at which case, if he invested money into his own ox, the damager doesn't get off the hook by mere appreciation. And we're going to also learn an opinion that if the market appreciates the value of the ox, that has nothing to do with the damager getting out of his obligation. So we've got 4 factors here, Gavin. We've got timeline, when it took place, improvements, but improvements in comparison to what the correct improvement should be, and if there is any latent damage to the extent that even though the ox improved, it didn't reach its full potential because of the injury. And then we're also dealing with an issue of saying, well, who paid for the appreciation of the ox? The damaged party fed it. The market price might have gone up, and there's different opinions in terms of can the damager benefit on that or not. But for now, what we have to know is that if the ox would have appreciated to 800 zuz and made a full healing recovery, the damager, Gavin, would have been free of any liability whatsoever. Okay. And obviously, they backdated and say, listen, it hasn't recovered, so you owe what you owe the 25 zuz because there wasn't full progress. Okay. So there has to be a question which is asked, which I'd like to ask you, that how come, Kevin, the damager only pays half according to the loss at the time of the initial damage and not half of the 400 zuz that the ox failed to appreciate due to the damage? Kev, do you want to have a chance at it?
Okay, I might get this wrong, but
okay, but first,
let me answer the second part first.
Yeah, but first give me the question back so I know you understood it. I might not have communicated it.
Okay, why does the damager? Why is the damager only liable for half the damage at time of goring?
No. I'm going to say it again. I said it wrong. I'm sorry. I might have said it wrong. What I'm saying is, look, there was 50 zuz worth of damage. In fact, the damager only owes 25 zuz. But the ox reached 400 zuz. And yes, it's better than 200. But the owner actually lost another 400 zuz because it would have, at that timeline, appreciated to 800 zuz. And Gavin might say, how? How do we know this? So the only example I could think of, Gavin, because I preempted your question, is I'm thinking that we have to take an example of a calf that at a certain age would reach a certain milestone if you fed it normally. It's the only example I can think of. Does that make sense? That's how they would work it out. Any vet will tell you that I found for my cat the other day, and they said according to its age, it's overweight by 1.1 kilograms according to the breed. So any vet will tell you this. So we're saying, let's take the calf stage, it's easier. So what I'm saying is, Kevin, that ox, if it had never been gored, would have got to 800 zuz after 6 months. It only got 400 zuz. So why do we make the damager, why are we so lenient on the damager that he only has to pay the 25 zuz and not maybe, let's say, half of that extra 400 zuz appreciation? Let's call it 200 zuz because it's a ton. So he should have paid 225 zuz and he's only paying 25 zuz. Why is he let off the hook of half the 400 zuz for the failed appreciation?
Maybe, I just thought of something. Maybe it's potentially it can reach a value of 800. Doesn't mean it will reach it. Maybe that's why there's leniency for the damager.
Okay, I think that's a strong point. I think it's a very strong point. Any thoughts, Gav?
Just repeat that, Kevin. Sorry, I didn't get it.
So maybe that there's leniency on the damager, that he's not liable for the increase in value to 800 instead of 400 because it's potential. Who says it will happen? It may not happen. It may only, even if the ox may have been undamaged or not been injured, it may only appreciate in value by up to 400. So maybe it's hypothetical. Maybe it's potential, but it's maybe that's why there's leniency for the damager. in terms of what he's liable for.
I would have that is absolutely correct, because this was a question by Rashi, and Rashi and Tosfot both give the answer. Because let me give you an example that Tosfot gives. If an ox kills a calf, the owner must pay the value. Why would the owner pay the value of a full-grown cow into which the calf could have eventually grown? In other words, say, for example, let's take a more ridiculous example. A boy is killed, okay? A boy is killed. Let's say a teenage boy is killed. And he hasn't left school yet, okay, in an accident or whatever. And the coffee payment that's done, apart from is different to the coffee payment of a married man with dependents and children and a spouse and parents he's looking after. Why? Because he's a breadwinner and he earns X amount as a chartered accountant every month in a very well-established accounting firm. Okay? And this teenage boy, didn't do that much more but smoke marijuana every second day. So the thing of it, you can't turn around and say, listen, he's going to be a rocket scientist, this kid, he's going to be a physician, we don't know. As Kevin,
he'll be involved. He'll be involved in the cannabis industry. That's what
he might be Pablo Escobar with billions. No one knows. But the thing of it is, Kevin's dead on the mark. We can't work on future hypotheses. Take your example and let's take Kevin's example. So Kevin's example is correct. In this case, we are lenient on the damager because by all intents and purposes, it could be considered that he would be paying according to that loss of that extra 400 zuz that the damaged party could have potentially had, and therefore as a time he paid 200 zuz. But that wouldn't that leniency, I don't know if it would take place whether you worked it at the time of the trial or according to the incident, because it wouldn't have made a difference for one reason. It appreciated at the time of the trial, but it takes the current appreciation compared with at the time of the goring. It doesn't take the difference. Even if you took it at the time of the goring, it doesn't show the appreciation of the further 200 zuz from 200 to 400. So if you're just taking the timeline of the goring to the actual timeline of the trial, in that particular case, it's to the benefit of the damaged, simply because he cannot get out of it by saying there was some form of progress. Some form of progress is only allowed if it makes a full healing recovery, number one, and number two, it appreciates fully to what it's value. So in other words, he's not penalized for the lack of full appreciation, but he is still penalized by having to pay, even if the ox appreciates, because it never appreciated properly according to the timeline. So it's quite fair. Does that make sense? Okay, Kabb, you want to summarize?
Yeah, no, I've got it. I'm clear.
No, you want to summarize for the group? You could say it probably easier than me.
No, I can't say it easier than you.
So if you have a look now, there's a contrast now. The injured ox deteriorates after the time of damage. The damager must pay half damages according to the assessment of the loss at the time of the standing before the court for judgment. So what we're saying is that the actual damaged animal depreciates. We don't use the timeline at the loss at the time of the incident. We actually take into account that this animal has suffered sustained damage, which is to the benefit of the injured party. Why do we do this, guys?
Say that again.
So I'm saying if we find, so before we spoke about a case of appreciation, here we're speaking about a case of depreciation. So we're saying if the injured animal depreciated, in other words, he went downhill from the time, health-wise, from the time of the goring to the time of the trial, we actually work out the cost at the time of the trial, which takes into account the depreciation of the damaged animal, which is to the benefit of the damaged party, because it means the damager has to pay more. Why do we do this?
Because of the depreciation.
Correct. Explain why, though.
So it's deteriorated. It had a certain value, let's say 200 zuz. and now it's depreciated to 100 zuz. So the animals got worse and worse and worse. So you need to pay for the full damage, because the animal's getting worse.
Correct. Perfect.
But it prejudices the damaged party.
No, it doesn't, because it suits the damaged party. Bearing in mind what it says here is Russia.
If it loses value,
no, it doesn't, not at all. Because say Gavin's ox gores yours, Kevin, and then the ox gets impaled with a horn, and it starts to deteriorate subsequent to the initial blow, right? Russia uses a term, the subsequent deterioration is the damages liability because your ox's horn is buried in my ox. In other words, the goring continues to depreciate the animal's levels of healing. In other words, the animal hasn't healed properly. It hasn't recovered from this wound. So why has the animal gotten worse? The court does ascertain one thing, Gavin. It ascertains the difference between if it's a case of the animal being worked by the damaged party to death, or if it was the damager's horn that caused it. Just give me a sec.
Yeah, that's also true.
Arthur?
All right. All right, so Kevin, listen, I'm sorry. What I should have done if you weren't feeling 100% is I should have maybe put the parameters where you could have answered or set up it so that you could have explained it.
No, I can, but I just won't do as good a job as you. There's no, I know it's like 70%, not as strong.
No, that's fine. So what I was hoping you do, which I know you know, is to basically say that if that it's a leniency on the damager for not paying the extra 200 zuz out of the 400 zuz for the failed appreciation from 400 to 800, because it's a ton. But it's to the damager's disadvantage that he can't turn around and say, well, the animal's appreciated at least 200 zuz from 200 to 400, and therefore I'm getting out of the payment. So it's fair. In other words, if the animal made a full health recovery, irrespective of the appreciation, and they assessed it, the damager doesn't have to pay. If it appreciated despite it, but not to its full capacity at that growth point after the vet assesses the animal, then for sure he has to pay. There's no question. He's lucky he doesn't have to pay more. He's actually very lucky. So this is to the damager's advantage to a certain extent. So I think that's what Gavin was going to say to a T. Am I right, Gav? Good.
So Dan, let me just see if I understand this. Okay. If the animal that damaged the attacker animal increased, he doesn't get the benefit of it. But if it decreased, he still gets it at the level of the original damage level. So let's say it was 200, dropped down to 100. He still gets it at the 200 level, not the 100 level of the animal. Because obviously the attacking animal could have also been damaged, and that's why it decreased.
No. We're not taking into a case where the animals damaged each other. This Bryce is dealing with the attacking ox and the damaged ox. We're also saying that if the animal decreased in health because not that it was overworked, but because
I think I'm going too far ahead then. Sorry, I listened to the whole of the 34. Sorry, my mistake.
Yeah. So it's good though. Okay. It's good though. So very straightforward. If the animal deteriorates from the goring to the trial, the damaged party is recompensed for all the physical deterioration from the injury. If it's deemed that the damaged party worked the animal to death, the damager doesn't have to pay for that sort of deterioration. Okay? Just bottom line, the damager is held mercifully, as Gavin would have said. I should have given him more of a chance. And it's mercifully because he should have paid, because of the animal failed to appreciate from 400 zuz to 800, it's a time attacking animal, he should have at least paid 200 zuz apart from the 25 zuz. But we can't do that because who's to say that animal wouldn't have gotten hit by a bus or died of malaria or smallpox? As Kevin said rightly, we don't know an animal's future. And just like we don't do the fair payment on a human being as a teenager for the same degree as a husband with children and a dependent, because the child could have died of an overdose, a motorcycle accident, he could have been a bum, he could have earned minimum wage, who knows? So you can't do based on future projections. However, the damager cannot get off the hook by saying, well, at least the ox appreciated from 200 to 400, so why should I pay? Because the failed appreciation assessment at the point where the ox should have been in that calf point and 6 months in means that the damager is still required to pay the 25 zuz. But if it had reached its growth point and the animal looked like it fully recovered by the time of trial, he would have been assessed at the time of trial, not at the time of goring of the incident. That's the summary. That's the bottom line summary.
Yeah, that's what I would have said, something along those lines.
Yeah, you would have said it probably more articulately, but I'm sorry I didn't give you a chance.
No. But I would have got close to that. I had that. Okay.
So we've got another 7 minutes left. Quickly, the Gemara examines the latter part of the brisa. Now, this part is a little bit hard. I'll tell you why. The master said in a brisa, if the value of the ox that damaged appreciated after it damaged, okay, the damager pays according to the value at the time of damage. I'm going to repeat it again. The Gemara examines the latter part of the brisa. The master said in the brisa, if the value of the ox that damaged. Now, before we were talking about the damaged ox. Now, this we're talking about is the ox that damaged, which is actually means the damager. So I don't know why I didn't use the word damager. I would have preferred if it uses the word injured and damager. In this case, it uses the word that damaged, which means the attacking ox. So I'm gonna can I repeat it in Damon words so it doesn't sound as complicated?
Yeah.
So basically, Gavin, the master said in the brisa, if the value of the attacking ox appreciated after it damaged, the damager pays according to the value at the time of damage. Okay? Whose benefit is that to?
Just repeat that last line and then I'll give the answer.
Good. Now you with me. Okay, so the attacking ox appreciated after it damaged, and he pays according to the value at the time of damage. So we're saying here's the trial, but after the trial, the attacking animal appreciated in value, but he only has to pay at the attacking animal's weight at the time it gored. That's when it was.
So it's a benefit of the damager. I'll tell you why.
Tell me.
Just hear me out in case I'm wrong, but I've got a good answer for this.
Relax.
Okay. So the reason why the damager benefits from this, because firstly, if it's a tom ox, if it's doubled in size weight-wise, then it goes according to the goof of that body.
And
so if it's valued at the time of the court case, it could have fattened right up. You'd have to pay a bigger amount. The other thing is, have I covered it fully?
Excellent, perfect.
Okay, so let's move on.
Okay, perfect. What we're saying is that it wouldn't really apply in this case, by the way. Difficult, because if you've got an attacked ox and attacking ox and they're both worth 200 zuz, and it's a tam ox, right? I would only have to pay 100 zuz based on what? The fact that your ox is only worth 200 zuz. So I'd pay a maximum of 100 zuz. So if my ox fattened up and it's 200 zuz, and I only have to pay 100 zuz because your animal is only worth 200 zuz, it wouldn't matter if my ox fattened up in this case.
Yeah, in this case, it won't. But if it fattened up to 300, then you'll have a problem.
Then you have a big problem. That's exactly it. So in this case, it wouldn't apply, but I think your point is totally valid. Just because it wouldn't apply in this price, it doesn't mean it's not a valid point. Okay, now who do you think's opinion is this and why?
So this opinion is actually Shmuel.
Rav Yishmael. Shmuel is different. Shmuel and Rav.
No. That's what I was trying to get at.
I know, but you got it right, but why? Explain why.
But Rabbi Yishmael says that you can't just, he's different to Rabbi Akiva. He says take the ox, sell it, and we share it, So Rabbi Yishmael says it's got to go through to the court. And the reason why I think he does that to go to the court, because he wants to see, one, if there's any depreciation, because then if there is depreciation, the damager has to pay more. If there's appreciation, he still has to pay, but it's based on the value at the time of goring. So either way, Rabbi Ishmael will be covered on both those issues.
Okay, firstly, I think you make a lot of sense that we're starting to see the brilliance of Rav Ishmael. In other words, Rav Ishmael saying that if it gets worse, you shouldn't be let off the hook easily because this animal's really suffered a hell of a lot. But by the same token, he's very fair that if there's an appreciation and how to balance the needs of both parties. But there's one problem I have with your question, is because the Gemara turns around and says if the animal appreciated, in other words, if the attacking animal appreciated after damage. What does appreciation mean? Just got bigger and worth more money. It pays according to the time of the damage. Now, if we turn around and say you pay at the time according to the damage, it does sound like Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva says at the time of damage you both sell the animal and divide the proceeds. You don't wait until the trial.
Correct, but yeah, you're not doing that. You just
I understand, but it seems contrary.
I think with all these accidents, they obviously take a value at the time of the incident because of the fact that the court cases obviously used to take place a month, 2-3 months later. So I would think that always happened. I didn't see that in the Gemara, but I would presume that must have been something that always took place. Unless you were Rabbi Akiva and you went according to him, you sold it, then at that point in time, you'd know exactly what the value is. The problem with Rabbi Akiva, and this is with due respect, because I obviously don't understand him properly, is that the way I see Rabbi Akiva, with my little minimal understanding, is that Rabbi Akiva is not taking into account any deterioration, any depreciation that might happen further along the line. So he's only taking the value at the time of the actual incident. He's not giving it a month or two to see how this animal recovers, if it gets worse or if it gets better or if it blossoms. That's my humble opinion. I'm sure I'm wrong, but that's the best I can do.
That's a good point, but it's the first time we're learning that Rav Yishmael also considers things at the time of the goring. Before we thought it was at the time of the trial, Rabbi Akiva was at the time. Now we're learning that Rav Yishmael is more complex. That's all I'm saying. Is that before we would have thought it's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. The reason why it's the opinion of Rav Yishmael is that there's only a lien on the ox for credit of money owed.